Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Endowment for Middle East Truth's weekly webinar discussing U.S.-Saudi relations under the Biden administration, featuring Mideast expert Jonathan Schanzer. As EMET's New York chapter president and board member, I thank you all for joining. For those listening in today for the first time who are not familiar with EMET, we are one of Washington, D.C.'s premier think tanks working on issues surrounding the Middle East and Israel and their implications on U.S. national security. We work daily and tirelessly on Capitol Hill with meetings with senators, congressmen, and their staffers to develop and implement pro-America and pro-Israel policies with great success. Our work is critical to the survival of the Jewish people, both in Israel and in the diaspora, as well as for strong U.S. national security more generally. And I urge you all to learn more about EMET by visiting our website at www.emetonline.org. Please consider supporting our critically important work with a financial donation as well, as it is your support that helps us to be able to continue our work, including our important and informative weekly webinars and other programming. These are very contentious times, and pro-Israel and pro-America voices must be heard on the Hill, lest we be drowned out by the louder voices who seek Israel's demise and a diminished America. I'm very happy to introduce our guest today, Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a DC-based nonpartisan research institute that focuses on national security and foreign policy, where John oversees the work of the organization's experts and scholars. Jonathan is also on the leadership team of FDD's Center on Economic and Financial Power, a project on the use of financial and economic power as a tool of statecraft. He previously worked as a terrorism finance expert at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, where he played an integral role in the designation of numerous terrorist financiers. He has held previous think tank research positions at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the Middle East Forum. Jonathan has written hundreds of articles on the Middle East, along with more than a dozen monographs and chapters for edited volumes. His 3 books have all made unique contributions to the field. And I also want to share that Jonathan has a new book coming out November 1st entitled Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War. And as John and I discussed, I think he is the first person to put out a book on the topic of the operation back in March. Jonathan testifies often before Congress and publishes widely in the American and international media. He has appeared on American television channels such as Fox News and CNN, and Arabic language television channels such as Al-Arabiya and Al-Jazeera. A sought-after public speaker, Jonathan has traveled widely throughout the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, Morocco, Kuwait, Qatar, Turkey, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories. Jonathan has studied Middle East history in 4 countries. He earned his PhD from King's College London, where he wrote his dissertation on the US Congress and its efforts to combat terrorism in the 20th century. He speaks Arabic and Hebrew. As a longtime supporter of FDD, it is my personal view that FDD is truly the most important and influential institute in Washington, D.C. EMET often turns to FDD experts and their research for our events and meetings on the Hill. And I've known Jonathan for well over a decade following his and FDD's work. So it's an honor to have him join us this afternoon to share with us his insights on the U.S.-Saudi relationship, as well as the implications of changes to that and other relationships in the Middle East and beyond. If you have something you'd like to ask Jonathan, you can post your question using the Q&A button on your screens below, and I'll do my best to get to as many of them as possible a bit later in the program. Today's event will be recorded and available for viewing in the coming days. Thanks so much for being here, John. I want to start by asking you about the history of the U.S.-Saudi relationship generally, perhaps beginning with 9/11 and moving forward to the Trump administration. I know that FDD has been integrally involved in various aspects of this complicated relationship, but it appears that the end of Trump's term culminated in a very strong alliance between the 2 countries. Can you spend a few minutes talking about the evolution of the relationship from 9/11 through Trump?
Sure, and thank you, Lori, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Naomi, for helping to pull all this together. And Sarah, I think I saw you in the attendees box. Just appreciate all the work that you guys do at EMET, and we appreciate your friendship here at FDD. Look, if we go back and look at the U.S.-Saudi relationship, it was one that was really forged on the steady supply of affordable oil, and that was always the sort of the pillar of the relationship. The Saudis also have played a leadership role in the Arab world as one of the leaders of the Arab League, and certainly the country that is viewed as the kind of religious authority within the Arab world, the Muslim world writ large. 9/11 placed a great strain on that relationship. The fact that there were a number of individuals involved in that al-Qaeda plot that were Saudi nationals, the fact that the Saudis had not perhaps dealt with Osama bin Laden himself as well as perhaps they should have or could have. It placed significant strain. And I was myself among a number of people that were calling for a crackdown on the Saudis, that they were responsible for terror finance around the world, that Wahhabism had contributed to the growth of radical Islam, Wahhabism worldwide. It was the madrasas, the schools, that propagated this radical interpretation of Islam worldwide, and had basically set fire to the system that we had grown to rely on. And so the Saudis, I thought, really, it was time for their comeuppance, as far as I was concerned, and I think many others. But the Bush administration saw things differently. The Bush administration tried to keep that relationship together. They worked very hard to address a lot of the terror finance concerns that had emerged in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. I had something of a front row seat for that when I worked for the Treasury Department, where a lot of those conversations were kept even away from my eyes. As I was tracking terror finance, that was really almost a separate track entirely, that was handled diplomatically and at a very senior level. I think that the efforts paid off over time. The Saudis began to volunteer themselves to begin to mitigate the problem of Wahhabism. And so we began to see a slow contracting of the Wahhabi problem. It was never fully gone, but the Saudis, I think, probably due in part to an Al-Qaeda problem inside their own borders, and in part due to US pressure, they began to crack down on terror finance internally. They stopped supporting Hamas. They stopped providing, $10,000 or more to the families of suicide bombers involved in the conflict with Israel. We began to see some positive steps. And that, of course, led to the emergence of Mohammed bin Salman, the new crown prince in 2013, who is a mercurial guy, to put it mildly, engaged in some questionable activities. But I think the takeaway was that on the one hand, he was an autocrat and ruled with an iron fist. On the other hand, he was still trying to pull Saudi Arabia into the 21st century. And this was kind of where the Trump administration came in. They tried to build off of that. And some of it was transactional, trying to bring Saudi money to the United States. There was a lot of it. But part of it was about trying to reshape the region, pushing for normalization, pushing for modernization, pushing for what we could only call, echoing the words of Shimon Peres, pushing for a new Middle East. I think that has run into a buzzsaw in recent years, and I think that's why Lori first reached out about this program. I think that, but I don't think it necessarily started with Biden. I think we can see the roots of that from the Obama years as well, and I'm very happy to talk about that.
So thanks, John. When I reached out to arrange the webinar, it was motivated by my concern that we've moved from developing a very positive relationship with the Saudi monarchy to a conscious decision, seemingly by the Biden foreign policy team, to downgrade that relationship. And I would almost characterize what I view Biden doing to the Saudis as similar to what Obama had done to the US-Israel relationship. Is this just more of Biden reversing anything and everything Donald Trump, or is there an ideological motivation for the steps that Biden has taken, which include removing the terrorist designation for Yemen's Houthis, who have been at war with the Saudis and are an Iranian proxy, pulling US military support out of Saudi Arabia, and announcing that the US would be declassifying the 9/11 reports that implicate the Saudis for their role in those attacks, which is also on the heels of the administration releasing the report that revealed the Saudi responsibility for the Khashoggi murder. And before you answer that, John, I want to share with everyone that you wrote a very powerful and informative essay in Commentary Magazine last month entitled "Diplomatic Arson in the Middle East: The Biden Administration's Torching of US-Saudi Relations," which is a must read on the topic. And when John is answering this question, I will put the link into the chat for everybody to access that article. So John, what in the world are they doing and thinking, and what's motivating the Biden admin in what looks to be yet another major foreign policy mistake?
Sure. I mean, look, I think let's just start with what we saw during the Obama years, because a lot of the Biden team, of course, hailed from the Obama administration. So, what we saw back then was an effort on the part of the Saudis during the Arab Spring in particular to try to crush Muslim Brotherhood movements that were sprouting up in places like Tunisia and Egypt and Syria and Yemen. It really became a battle between what I would call the royalists, led by Saudi Arabia, versus the Islamists, led by Qatar and Turkey. And there was, I would call it an intra-Sunni battle. We typically think about, the battle between Sunnis and Shiites in the Middle East. There was this division, a fairly sharp division that we've seen manifest itself in a number of ways in recent years. But there was a battle for power in a changing Middle East. And the Obama administration chose the Islamists. They initially looked to support the Muslim Brotherhood factions, leaned heavily on the Qataris and the Turks. And the Saudis ultimately came out on top regardless. In other words, the balance shifted toward the royalists. And I think the Obama administration did not appreciate the fact that, it was the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, the Bahrainis, and others that were really part of that. Another element of the story is, of course, the Iran nuclear deal, where the Saudis were vehemently opposed to a deeply flawed nuclear deal that was going to give Iran what we typically call at FTD, a patient pathway to a nuclear weapon, while also yielding roughly $150 billion in sanctions relief. The Saudis were understandably not happy about that as well. And so we began to see kind of a coalition building during the Obama years of the Saudis and the other royalists working hand in hand quietly behind the scenes with the likes of Israel. And that, of course, didn't play well either, given the antipathy that we saw of the Obama administration for Israel, given Bibi Netanyahu's opposition to the JCPOA of 2015. So you could see that things were shifting in a way that the Obama team did not necessarily appreciate. Then you had this interregnum, let's call it, the 4 years of the Trump administration, where things just went, it was like 180 degrees in the other direction. Trump, went to, there was that famous picture of when Trump went to Saudi Arabia, and he and Sisi, in the King of Saudi Arabia, all sat there with their hands on this orb. And it kind of looked like this bromance was brewing between Trump and a number of Saudi leaders. And, there were arms sales in place. There was talk about Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords in the last year of Trump's presidency. All of these things seem to indicate that things were moving in a different direction. And now we're back at whiplash, where we've gone back another 180 degrees, right back to where we were under Obama. I think some of it is about trying to just simply reverse Trump administration policies. There is a strong pull for Biden administration officials to do just that. There's also, I would say, some equivocation as it relates to the Iran nuclear deal, questions about Islamism and its place in the Middle East. There are broader questions about whether America should be asserting itself or even trying to dictate the outcome of certain conflicts in the region. And that's something that the Saudis, I think, would take issue with. I think, if anything, right now, the Saudis would like to see America return back to its previous positions of being anti-Islamist, anti-Iran, pro-America, if I can put it rather bluntly. And they're not quite seeing that from the Biden administration, which I think is trying to balance some tricky politics. You've got the progressive left that, in many ways appears to be apologetic for the Iranians and for the Muslim Brotherhood and the like. And so we see some backpedaling on policies that I thought were somewhat solid. I will say as a caveat, the Trump policies were not cohesive. We did not see a Trump doctrine really emerge throughout his presidency, but the policies that he adopted with regard to Saudi Arabia seemed very logical and seemed to be pushing Saudi Arabia in the right direction, although there were, of course, some real problems, such as the Khashoggi murder, and other anti-democratic or illiberal actions taken by the regime. But I think, as I was talking before about the way the Bush administration handled it, I like that much better now in retrospect, the idea of quietly guiding the Saudis toward a more liberal place, especially since they're already on that path, rather than hammering them over the head as what we have seen over the last year. And I certainly, I think it's not resonating well with the Saudis, and I'm fearful that they may go running into the hands of America's adversaries, such as China or Russia or even Iran, where we're seeing some negotiations right now. And that is certainly not good news from my perspective.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about that a little bit later. But right now, while we're on this part of the conversation, what are the regional implications for the U.S. inserting this, what I would call, daylight, which they've called before, that was the Obama term for what he was inserting in the U.S.-Israel relationship. So now we're seeing daylight in the U.S.-Saudi relationship. In your article, you stated, and this is your quote, if Saudi Arabia no longer sees America as a partner to counter Iran malign activity across the region, Riyadh could revert to old security paradigms that have proved disastrous in the past, namely the export of violent ideologies abroad. Can you touch on the implications for the Eastern Mediterranean countries and Gulf nations, as well as the Red Sea region?
Sure. Look, I have a kind of a list here of things where I think Saudi has a real role to play in the future of the Middle East. And all these things are crucial to the United States. And it's remarkable that we would be sort of turning our backs on these things. So the first is, and I think, very relevant for our conversation today, the Abraham Accords. The Saudis were right on the precipice, I think, of potentially joining hands with Israel and making peace. I think with the change of administration, change of policy, I think they're really thinking twice about it. I'm not saying that they would have done it right away, but I think they were flirting with it quite openly, and it would be a shame to miss that opportunity. I think if Saudi Arabia goes in this direction, the dominoes will fall across the Middle East. I think normalization will be a foregone conclusion for just about every other country in the Muslim world, given the role that Saudi Arabia plays. Then we've got Eastern Med. It's increasingly an important construct for us all to look at, for the energy implications alone, but also there are new alliances that are forming between, it's Israel and Cyprus and Greece, as well as, Egypt. You've got Libya that hangs in the balance as a result of all of this. And then, of course, there's Turkish aggression that they're looking to counter. This is a critically important region, this Mediterranean region, and the Saudis have thrown their support behind the good guys, as I would call them, and pushing back against the likes of the Turks and others that have been trying to destabilize, including even Russia. So I see the Eastern Med as a crucial component here. Then, as you mentioned, Lori, there's the question of Wahhabism. We've seen the damage that the spread of Wahhabism can do. We've also seen the positive results of what happens when Saudi Arabia pulls support for that project. And that has been happening in recent years. We don't want to see a backsliding there. We want Saudi Arabia to remain committed to the fight against Wahhabism. And it's just shocking to me that we wouldn't be working with them in this way. There's also, I think, the issue of Holocaust education and kind of the embracing of a history that Saudi Arabia refused to acknowledge for many years, and is now, through the Muslim World League in particular, a guy by the name of Muhammad Isa has been at the forefront of pushing the Muslim world to acknowledge the crimes that were committed against the Jewish people. This is hugely important, not because Jewish people need affirmation of what happened, but rather that the Arab world has been perpetuating, the protocols of the Elders of Zion and other anti-Semitic tracts over the years, and they've embraced a sort of Nazi ideology in some cases in opposition to Israel. This has obviously kept the Middle East on a low flame, if not a high one, in over the course of decades. And the fact that the Saudis have been pushing in the right direction on this is just hugely important. And I think Saudi Arabia needs the pat on the back for doing this, and it's remarkable that we're seeing a backsliding. There are other things I'll just briefly note. Malaysia and Indonesia, incredibly important countries, Muslim countries in Asia. The Saudis have immense influence there. I think the United States should be leveraging it. I don't want to see that leverage lost. There's Red Sea security. A huge amount of trade goes through this area where Saudi Arabia has significant influence on the security over there. Iraq stability. Iraq has been under assault by Iranian influence. The Saudis have been the ones that traditionally push back on that. We're losing leverage there if we lose the Saudis. And then there's Yemen, and this is just, and I'll end here, but Yemen, it's one of these things where, that war against the Houthis, or Ansar Allah as they're known, is roundly derided by a lot of Democrats. They're saying that the Saudis have, carried out attacks that have led to mass civilian deaths, and those things are true. I mean, the Saudis are not a particularly wonderful military. I don't think they have the kind of experience and the expertise that the Israelis have, for example. But they are fighting a war against an Iranian-backed militia. It is not unlike Hezbollah or Hamas. And if we yield that territory to Iran, that only helps Iran expand its influence across the region. This is something that even those that are pushing for the Iran nuclear deal, or return to that 2015 nuclear deal, even officials like Rob Malley will still say that we still need to curb Iranian influence. And the idea that we would just sort of relinquish any influence on that conflict is, to me, also shocking. So there's a lot at play here, and I think not a lot of that is widely understood, that Saudi has increasingly played an important and positive role in recent years, and I don't want to see that slip away.
Yeah, you've covered a lot of ground there, John, and I'm glad that you touched on Yemen, because I was going to ask you to discuss the more broad, the worldwide implications of a Saudi loss in Yemen. The price of oil, global terrorist activity, and of course, as you point out, the rise of Iran. And I do think that the Biden administration is motivated in much of what they're doing these days to appease Iran, it seems like, to get back to the JCPOA. Do you think that that's correct?
I think that's right. I think, look, there are a couple of other things at play. I mean, one is there is a question of whether we're pivoting out of the Middle East entirely, and we can certainly unpack that if you'd like. But, one gets a sense that between Afghanistan and, Iraq, Syria, I mean, we're even hearing about, a potential exit from the Sinai Peninsula, where we have multinational forces, that there is a decision that we just need to get out of the Middle East, where nothing is paid off and there's nothing good to be achieved from this. So, you have to look at it in that broader context. I think that would be a huge mistake. I think the Middle East still has immense importance for the U.S., and I don't think it needs to be all or nothing. Part of, what we've been hearing from the far left, what we would call neo-isolationists, is that we need to get out of forever wars, and they make it a binary equation, right? They make it so that, the assumption here is that either we have, thousands of forces on the ground fighting in perpetuity, or we leave. And I think what we can say with certainty now is that with a small footprint, the United States can have an influence and can keep malign actors at bay. And so, I see the importance of maintaining a small force for that reason alone, keeping Iran at bay. But I think the pull right now is very strong among isolationists. I should note, by the way, on the left and the right. Charles Lindbergh is alive in both the Republican and Democratic parties right now, where people are saying we have no business being anywhere in the world. I think we need to re-examine that. I think the Afghanistan debacle is a pretty good moment for us to stop and reflect and to think about all the different ways that we could lose without having that American influence in the Middle East and elsewhere around the world.
It's shocking to me that the lesson from 9/11, that one of my takeaways was, if we don't fight it over there, it's coming to us anyway. So I was going to ask you in a little while about Afghanistan, but as long as you've brought that up, let's talk about that for a minute. You wrote an article entitled "The Bizarre Positive Biden Spin on Afghanistan. No, the Taliban are not America's partners." We could spend all afternoon discussing this, and I did have your colleague Tom Jocelyn last month on the topic of Afghanistan. But given the Biden administration's either naive or ignorant belief that the Taliban are our partners, they're moderate, and the U.S. and the Taliban have this common enemy in ISIS-K, can you spend a few minutes discussing the far-reaching consequences of our surrender in Afghanistan, and perhaps again touch on Iran, China, and Russia, and how they benefit from our departure from the region?
Sure. Look, first, I think what we're seeing right now, the spin, is something that we've seen from even the Syrian civil war, where, when ISIS rose up there, we began to hear from, not actually even from the administration, but from, let's just say, counterterrorism analyst circles that were close to the Obama administration, that people began to talk about the Nusra Front, as this is the Syrian affiliate of Al-Qaeda, as moderate relative to ISIS. this is the wrong construct, right? These are all people that still see Christians, Jews, non-believers all as the enemy. These are people that have an apocalyptic vision for the Middle East. And there is no moderate, right? There is no good guy. It's alien versus predator, if we can put it in the simplest terms, right? And the fact that they're fighting doesn't mean that there's one side that we should be choosing. It means that there are a bunch of bad guys, which is just increasingly happening right now in what we would call the global disorder, right? Where in Libya is another place where we see that, even Yemen to a certain extent, right? There are bad guys all around and they're all fighting each other. And it doesn't mean that we should be choosing one side and say, well, they're better than the other one, so let's still pick murderers to run this country. Now, the broader withdrawal, I have huge problems with, because I think we're sending messages to the likes of Israel and to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE and elsewhere that we're gone. We're going to go pivot to Asia. Good luck with this part of the world. If you need us, give us a call. I'm not telling you that we are going to help you, but by the way, we're also working with Iran to give them additional sanctions relief and welcome them back into the community of nations, which I should also note, the US is thinking about doing the exact same thing with the Taliban right now. Really terrible messaging in terms of, America's morals. I think we're losing our moral compass. And then there's the broader geostrategic picture, which I think you were hinting at when you talked about China and Russia. And that's this, that America has been the world superpower for 76 years. And during that time, we have seen a real expansion of democracy and freedom, free market economies. We've seen massive advances in technology, in medicine, in food security, in the overall health and wealth of the world. And it would not have happened without American ingenuity, and it would not have happened without American leadership. And, there are people who are saying, okay, well, the sun's setting on the American century. Okay, it's fine if you want to say that, but you have to think about what it means. What happens moving forward? And this is what I'm concerned about, right? If you think about, when the sun set on the British Empire, the United States was there to grab the baton. And what we did is we ensured that the world remained in a good place with a recognizable order, and it was being infused with American values. Maybe not dominated, as there were still battles taking place between, the Soviets and the United States. The Cold War was a major fixture for much of this time, but we created a structure that was understandable, and it was also one that helped guide things to a better place. If the sun sets now in the American century, 3/4 of a century, who takes over? And I think, look, some people say it'll be a multipolar world. Okay, that's possible. It could also be that a country like China takes over, or that Russia has significant influence more than it should. And I think that the outcome of such a move would be catastrophic for world security. I think that you would immediately begin to see the difference. It would feel like night and day. And I think that I think too many people forget how important America's influence has been over these 76 years. And I, for one, hope that it continues. I'm fearing that we may soon be reading, the obituary of the American-led world order. I hope we don't.
I have the same fears, and I lose a lot of sleep at night. I hope we're both wrong. So, John, you touched on the Abraham Accords, and I know this is a question that a lot of people probably have. I just want to delve a little bit deeper on it. The Saudis, as you pointed out, were seemingly close to making a deal when Trump was in office, but the Biden admin has seemingly made clear that it has no real interest in expanding the negotiations, nor does it seem to have the capacity to bring nations together. As we learned recently that instead of talking with the Israelis, the Saudis have now had their third meeting with the Iranians. The third meeting was this past weekend, I believe, or the week before, and they've been meeting with them since Biden entered office. I actually picture the Biden folks, high-fiving each other for getting the Saudis to sit across the table from the Iranians. But this doesn't seem to bode well for Israel, and nor does it bode well for the U.S., since despite all of the efforts of the Obama-Biden echo chamber to convince the world that Iran's sponsorship of terrorism isn't really all that dangerous, the U.S. is, after all, the great Satan in Iran's view as well. So when the Saudis weigh whether to move forward with Israel or whether they base their decision on military or security considerations to counter the Iran hegemon, you know, is the U.S. going to play a role in pressuring the Saudis to turn to Iran as opposed to Israel? And how does the U.S. negotiations with Iran to restart the JCPOA play into all of this?
All good questions. Look, the first thing to say about the Abraham Accords and the Saudi role was that the Abraham Accords would not have happened without Saudi Arabia's support. All four of the countries that made peace with Israel last year were and are in the Saudi orbit. They are junior partners to one extent or another. You know, the UAE is a much stronger player, almost a peer when it comes to Gulf politics. Bahrain, a more junior player and very much, you know, following the lead of Saudi Arabia and UAE. Morocco, a dependent upon Saudi Arabia, part of that Sunni bloc. And I think, you know, once they expressed interest, the Saudis, I think, gave them a green light. Even Sudan is a really interesting, fascinating test case, right? I mean, the Saudis pulled them out of the Iranian orbit. They were a state sponsor of terrorism with Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah crawling all over the country. The leadership there, with guidance from Saudi Arabia, moved away from all of that activity. And then ultimately they made the move toward Israel. So this was all a Saudi-led or Saudi-endorsed initiative leading up to these peace agreements. And that's why I thought that Saudi Arabia was close. And what close means, I don't know. It could have been a year away, 5 years away. Saudi moves glacially. That's just we talk about their government. We always talk about them as conservative with kind of a lowercase c, that they just move at their own pace, and it's usually glacial. But I would say that whatever progress had been made, they are now probably they've hit pause. I don't know if we're necessarily backsliding. I think they're waiting to see right now how these relationships play out. I think, by the way, the Gaza war, and I write about this in my book, the Gaza war in May was an important stress test for the Abraham Accords and for Saudi to see in particular that, you know, the fact that all four agreements survived that war and that there was not significant domestic unrest as a result of those peace agreements, I think was a real important milestone for the Abraham Accords, and probably gave the Saudis at least some confidence that if they wanted to do the same, that they would survive it. But then I think gets to your final point, which is the pressure that they're feeling from the administration. The fact that the Biden administration voided out the terrorist designation of the Houthis, the fact that they released additional and really unnecessary basic information about the Khashoggi murder, the fact that they are, they're going to release information relating to the 9/11 attacks, which is really, I think, just a nod to the squad. If we're going to be honest about it, all of these things are, I think, undermining Saudi's faith in the United States, and I think raises questions about what they get out of it. Now, one last thing, and I'll give a little bit of credit to the Biden administration. There was a time earlier this summer where it was unclear whether the Biden administration would even endorse the Abraham Accords. They would even recognize you had Ned Price, the spokesman for the State Department. You're nodding, or you probably saw this video. The guy couldn't say Abraham Accords at a press conference, at a press briefing. And there was just a real challenge to get the Biden administration to acknowledge the importance of this and to embrace these new constructs. And, I was talking to a journalist about this, and it would be, you can't even imagine this. Can you imagine the Reagan administration refusing to acknowledge the Camp David Accords because Jimmy Carter negotiated them? It would have never happened. It would have been an embarrassment. Eventually, I think the Biden administration realized that that would have been a huge mistake. And we finally saw an acknowledgement, a celebration of these agreements at the 1 year mark. It just passed. And so I think the Biden administration just came around. I think that the fact that that happened is going to give additional strength to the existing agreements. And again, we'll get the Saudis thinking about what they might be able to get as well. Again, the only problem is that it seems like there's two things happening at once. The administration pushing for normalization to the extent that it is, while simultaneously hammering the Saudis for things that are 2, 3, 10, 20 years old. that in some cases, they can't be undone. I still think that there's reform that the Saudis can enact, and they can own up to mistakes that they've made. But I think that the current approach of almost all sticks and no carrots is not the way to go.
There have been a couple of people that have asked about whether what's going on within the Saudi, I guess, hearts and minds and the Saudi people, and whether they would ever accept normalization with Israel. So in the context of addressing that question, forms that have been implemented under the Crown Prince. But can you all maybe elaborate a little bit more on his Vision 2030 and talk about those reforms in the context of what it means for the Saudi people and therefore relationships with Israelis?
Sure. I mean, look, Vision 2030 is a laudable vision. I don't know how realistic it is, all of it, but the idea is to convert Saudi Arabia from a rentier economy, one that, basically thrives on a passive income from the sale of oil, to one where the Saudi people are generating more business directly through brain power and through business and commerce and through the contribution of taxes and things that basically constitute more participation and ultimately more liberalization in a society. And so the idea that the king or that the Crown Prince wanted to go in this direction, I think, is laudable. And some of the reforms that we've seen, alongside these changes, the dialing back of support for Wahhabism, the allowing women to drive, easing some of the restrictions on women in general in the kingdom, recognizing the validity of other religions. And by the way, just opening up the country to allow for people like me to come a handful of times and meet not just leaders, but also people on the ground. Remarkable change. I mean, I never in a million years when I got into this business, something like 20 years ago, I never thought I would ever step foot in Saudi Arabia. And here I am, Jewish kid from Philadelphia, walking into Riyadh and taking meetings. And it's remarkable change. So the question is, how much more can be done with this Crown Prince? I think the answer is quite a bit. But the problem is that, with those changes, with those reforms, will also come steps backward. And we've seen it with the Khashoggi murder. And I will not tell you that it was anything other than a murder. The locking up of Saudi royalty and Saudi businessmen in the Ritz in 2017 was another moment where everybody kind of said, okay, that's not reform. So again, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and that's part of I think that's going to be the way things go for quite some time. I'll take that over what Saudi Arabia was in 2001, 2004, right? It was a country that saw no transformation, no prospects for change. Now, when it comes to Israel, when it comes to everything else, the people, look, it's going to take a while for the Saudi people to accept Israelis. Even if the government does decide to normalize, I think it will be something that the people won't do for a while. It's going to take some time to warm up, and the change is going to need to, we just need to expect things to move slowly. There's the other part of this too, which I have some concerns about, and we've seen it across the Arab Spring. I look at Libya in particular. When you open up a country very quickly and you begin to tear down some of the severe restrictions that have been put in place, you can see that it sometimes leads to chaos. And so I am very much in favor of shepherding this process along with American assistance, incrementally working in ways that feels right for the Saudis. As long as progress continues and you don't see a stalling out and you don't see stonewalling from MBS or others, I'm very heartened by what I've seen, with the caveats of some of the real ugly missteps that the Saudi regime has taken.
What role does his father have? Does the king have in any normalization with Israel?
He's the guy pumping the brakes, quite honestly. This is a guy that is from the old school. and his son is from the new school. His son's the one that's kind of pushing for reform and greater engagement. And by the way, I would argue that with the kind of the reversal of fortune of the Saudis under the Biden administration, I think you could argue that the king now has maybe just a bit more, a little bit more clout. He can say, look, you know, we did it your way and we made those changes, and now look, we're still getting wrapped on the knuckles by this administration. You know, let's take it slow. And again, I think you're going to see fits and starts. You're going to see steps forward and steps back, and it's just going to be, that is, you know, and you know, you got to remember, this is not a democracy. This is, you know, personality driven politics, and the center of gravity within the royal family shifts in ways that we cannot discern. And I find it frustrating, by the way, as an observer of the region, but I also understand that, you know, these are not things that I will be able to predict. All I can say is that as long as there are people that are interested in reform and that have power, flawed as they are, I think we're still doing, we're doing the right thing. We're on the right path.
Yeah. Sarah actually sent in a question, and she said that although the Antony Blinken acknowledged the significance of the Abraham Accords finally on September 17th, can you please discuss what happened in Erbil, Afghanistan on September 24th, and the fact that we do not hear anything out of the administration that these brave Iraqi dissidents were willing to risk their lives to have Iraq join the Abraham Accords and now risk imprisonment, torture, and possibly their very lives?
Yeah, I mean, look, Sarah, you raise a great point, and it's obviously not Saudi's role to defend this, but I think it's a good indication of where the administration is on normalization, which is to say, still lukewarm in terms of pushing aggressively. So you had this group of reformers that have basically decided to challenge anti-normalization norms and laws. And by the way, it's not just in places like Erbil in Iraq. We've seen it in Lebanon and other places around the Middle East, where, for example, marrying an Israeli is, you know, grounds for losing your passport. You know, I mean, things that are just really horrible that only encourage deeper distrust and hate. And so this one group came out and called for normalization, then found themselves under threat by an Iraqi government that is, you know, widely influenced by Iran and its militias. And then you began to see a backpedaling. And it would have been great for the administration to say, we support them, and Iraq, you know, slow your roll, curb this kind of rhetoric. We didn't see it. And I think it's a huge problem. And I think we need to have a more principled approach to promoting normalization, whether it's formal or informal. And this was an informal approach. This was just individuals expressing their opinion about what should be done. And they should have been getting our support. And so I think we've got a tough road ahead of us. This is not going to be easy. By the way, I'll just say that the Pentagon also came out and there was a really horrible tweet where they said, we've recently become aware of the fact that this took place. We had no idea about it. We had no role to play, just for the record. And I mean, I tweeted like, this was quite a profile and courage from the Pentagon that this would even come out from them. But you get a sense of the sensitivity and the concern about balancing our existing diplomacy and our existing force posture versus the long-held beliefs of the Arab world, which really must change. And that change, I think, really does need to come from the top here in the United States.
Yeah. So someone asked, Biden has, among many other things, returned us to the 70s relative to our energy independence. What role will oil play in our relationship with Saudi Arabia and our ability to maintain leverage over China and Iran?
Look, right now, the Saudis have a lot more leverage. We're going to see, oil shock, energy shock, in our immediate future, I think. And yes, it feels like we're sort of slipping back into the 70s, and at least in some senses. I do think that Saudi Arabia is going to have some challenges ahead as we move away from oil, as we go to, alternative fuels, as we go, to rare earth minerals that, power the electric cars, we'll begin to see a shift away from oil. I think that's positive as a general rule. I think it will make Saudi Arabia and some of these other countries, just like any other country in the world, where our job is going to be to negotiate with them based on values and shared concerns around the region, as opposed to the very transactional approach that has dominated the US-Saudi relationship over the years. So I welcome it. I think the Saudis already know that this is coming, and that explains Vision 2030, which we've already discussed. But for the interim, I see the Saudis gaining more leverage, and it does raise open questions about how much they go running into the arms of China, which is going to, it's a country that's going to need massive amounts of oil, cooperating with Russia, which is an oil exporter as well. But certainly, I still, for one, very much embrace the idea of energy independence here in the United States.
As I think most of us do. Somebody asked, what is your assessment on the chances that Israel will perhaps turn to Russia or China, as it is, China was operating the port in Haifa, for example?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating question, and one that I continue to grapple with my colleagues at FTD, and in fact with other think tanks in Washington. We're trying to sort of build a brain trust that can wrestle with some of these questions. On Russia, I have to say I don't see Israel changing its policy anytime soon. There are people that say that Israel has an alliance with Russia. That is way overblown. I take issue with that assessment. Yes, Israel goes to Russia on a regular basis, and they have very important strategic conversations, primarily about how Israel needs to bomb certain Iranian assets in Syria, where Russia is based. And as I have heard it from multiple Israeli officials now, that these are not requests. This is Israel coming in very tough circumstances to Putin and saying, we are going to do this. This is our neighborhood. This is our self-defense. We are expecting you to stand aside. And Russia respects Israel's ability, and it respects Israel's needs, but this is not an alliance at all. I have heard, by the way, that Putin, at the end of these tough conversations, sort of tries to inject some levity and says, I noticed you're flying these, crappy American-made F-16s. Why don't you take one of my Sukhoi jets out for a ride? See how you like that. Maybe we can make a deal, And the Israelis say, no, thanks. We're happy where we are. And that's the end of the conversation. So let's take Russia off the table as far as this alternative alliance structure is concerned. The real issue, I think, that's coming up right now is the fact that Israel relies on China for something like 10 to 15% of its GDP. And that's a big number. And it means that Israel can't just turn its back on China. And Israel is very aware of the fact that America is ramping up a great power competition with China. The question is, what is Israel's role? Is Israel expected to do as it did in 1950 when the Korean War broke out, and to immediately throw its lot behind the United States against the Soviet Union and against the Axis? I think that is a tough thing for Israel to do. It does not want to make an enemy out of China, especially given the leverage that China has in its economy. Now, that doesn't mean that it wants to support Chinese aggression or to support Chinese weapons platforms that China may use ultimately against the United States. I think Israel wants to be able to do business with China in the same way that America does business with China, which is buying cheap products, using Chinese cheap labor, looking for opportunities where they pop up to help infrastructure and things like that. Now, those things are going to probably come under a microscope in the coming months and years. Israel's primary challenge is going to be looking at technology that has dual use. Artificial intelligence, primarily data-driven weapons that Israel has immense experience with. In fact, if you read some of the reports, the Gaza war, I talk about this in the book as well, the Gaza war in May, the Israelis used, they said 15% of their war was fought with artificial intelligence tools. China would love to get their hands on this. And these are the rules that America and Israel are going to have to iron out in the coming months and years. What is off limits? What is okay? What needs to be negotiated behind closed doors in terms of what Israel shares with the Chinese? These are the things that are going to happen, but I don't see the Israelis looking elsewhere for another alliance. I think they understand that Israel and the US have, it's not even a special relationship. I mean, this is the relationship that brought Israel into the 21st century. It's really interesting. I read, for anybody who hasn't read it, read a book by James McDonald, who was the first ambassador from the United States to Israel. He was Truman's first ambassador. And you read about the warm ties even back then, even before the special relationship was formed. And I think Israel understands this. It's not going to change. I just know that there are some challenging discussions ahead as it relates to China, particularly as it grows into that superpower that I think we all expect it to become, if it isn't one already.
Yeah. Well, on the heels of that, someone had asked the question of, given the withdrawal from the region by the U.S., does Israel have the ability to become sort of that strong horse on behalf of itself and its allies in the region?
Yes, but with one major caveat, and that is that the United States needs to be comfortable continuing with the terms of the MOU that was signed in, I guess it was 2016, that provides Israel with $3.8 billion a year, and most of that being in military support. That when Israel asks for plus-ups in the immediate aftermath of conflicts like the one we just saw in May, that we don't see debates forwarded by what I would call the Hamas caucus of the House of Representatives, pushing for a zeroing out of Iron Dome, which is a defensive weapon, or precision-guided munitions, which is what enables Israel to be able to hit a terrorist inside a building on a specific floor without causing additional collateral damage, and keeping the number of casualties at 211 as opposed to thousands, which would have happened 50 years ago of a war of this nature. And so the United States is going to have to come to terms with the fact that, especially as we leave the Middle East, that Israel is going to need that support. If the United States wants the Israelis to be the strong horse and to be able to maintain a modicum of order in the region and to continue to develop new alliances in the Arab world and to work with the East Med and with the other constructs that are forming in the region, we cannot be debating whether Israel has a right to defend itself. We cannot be debating whether Israel should be getting defensive weapons that protect 9 million people from rockets that are fired blindly into civilian airspace. And we cannot debate whether Israel has a right to hit the people that are launching those rockets with precision munitions. This is a very basic thing, but unfortunately, the debate on Capitol Hill is not basic at all. It's very convoluted and very, I would say, confusing, given the pivot that the United States is looking to make out of the region. They need friends, and they need friends who embrace the same morals and ethics that the United States has traditionally embraced over the years. There are not many choices out there. In fact, I would say there's one choice. And yet we see from the likes of AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and the rest of the Hamas caucus, we see them injecting some amount of doubt into this. And I think it's extremely counterproductive, not just for Israel, but for the United States as well.
There's such a high level of ignorance on the Hill seemingly these days when it comes to Israel and the region, and it's if not more often. Is there a possibility of Israel being able to take out the Iranian nuclear infrastructure? If so, how will they also defend against the thousands of missiles that will likely be fired from Lebanon?
The answer is yes, and I think the Israelis have lots of means to do it. It won't be easy. The Israelis have cyber means, and they've got an advanced military, and they've been planning for this moment for a long time if they need to. But I think the broader point that you raise about missiles coming from all over the place is what I'm concerned about. Today's actually the 48th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, and that was a multi-front war, and it was one that took Israel by surprise. But you saw the immense damage that it did to Israel. They lost 2,500 people. They had 7,500 injured, and it really was a scar on the psyche of Israel. And, I think the fear is that, with an attack on the Iran nuclear program, you could see attacks from Hamas in the south, attacks from Hezbollah in the north, attacks from other Iranian proxies in Syria, missile attacks from, Iraq, Yemen, Iran itself. It could be rather devastating. And so this is, I think, again, why we need to really think very carefully about the kinds of debates that we're having now about what Israel needs, and talking about plan B for what happens if nuclear diplomacy collapses, which I fully expect that it will. Israel is going to need America's support if America, is inclined to give it. And so hugely consequential right now, the debate that's taking place on the Hill. And what's really remarkable to me, I should just probably add, is that the numbers of people that are advocating for a change in our current posture are very small, but they have, for whatever reason, outsized influence with this administration. I don't think, by the way, that Biden is a member of the squad or someone who agrees with the squad, but I do think that he is trying to cover his left flank as he sees this as a surging element of his party. And I think it makes a lot of sense for him to shut it down now, as opposed to appeasing it, which I think he did to one extent or another during the most recent Gaza conflict. And I talk about that in my book as well. The rhetoric did not match his actual support for Israel, which was really unwavering. But the rhetoric is what's concerning, because what it does is it emboldens the squad, the Hamas caucus, to continue down the line with what they've been saying. And that's unacceptable in my view.
John, I know that you have to leave at 1, and you touched on the JCPOA negotiations, and can you just end by letting us know your view is that you don't think that they're going to be successful? I mean, I'm very nervous. I think that the Iranians are now asking for 10 billion in cash, and Biden seems to be caving on the sanctions, and FDD's worked so hard on the sanctions over the years and successfully. What can you just summarize briefly, because I know you have to go, where we are on that?
Look, we're extremely concerned. I think we see a lead negotiator on the part of the administration with Rob Malley as someone who just can't give enough concessions away to a regime that does not deserve one of those concessions. And so that's extremely problematic. What I would say, though, is that we've seen the Iranians themselves, the regime, gum up the works. They have been less than willing to engage. But that may change, and I don't want to rule it out. But I think you have a hardline leader, if I may call him that, with Ibrahim Raisi. And this is a guy that doesn't seem like he's going to want a whole lot of give and take. If we see a huge collapse of the American negotiating position, I'm sure that the administration will hear quite a bit about it from the likes of probably most people on this call, as well as from FDD, from EMET, and many others. Let's hope that the administration holds the line and doesn't make concessions that we'll come to regret. But it's still very much up in the air. I would just say that of late, we have seen Iranians making it harder to get to yes, which we'll see whether that continues.
John, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us this afternoon, as I'm sure everybody listening in does as well. And thank you all for joining. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar next Wednesday, and have a good afternoon. Thanks again, John.